Good morning. I'm Father Tom Malionik, and I'm the rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Kinderhook, New York. And today is Tuesday, June 2nd. We are here with installment number 17 of the Morning Musings, which is a work in progress, and I think we're getting a little bit better at it. I'm getting a little bit better at it the more I do this. It's an opportunity for us to reflect a little bit more on the texts that we encounter in the daily office of morning prayer in particular, but also an opportunity for us to discuss if there are other questions that come up, if there are other issues that come up. Today we'll talk a little bit about the saints we commemorate today. If there are other issues that people have, then by all means feel free to enter a comment, and I will take those into consideration as I prepare ongoing installments of this. Keeping in mind, of course, that our goal here is not just simply information. We're not here just simply to talk about facts, and we're not here to exchange opinions. What we're really here to do is to grow as disciples of Jesus Christ. We're here to grow as icons of the living God alive in the world, making God's love and truth and justice and presence known to the world in our own lives, in the way we live, in who we are, and how we think and speak and act, and also in the choices that we make, and the values that we hold, and the priorities that we set for ourselves and for our families, and for wherever we have input into that. So our goal here is to really address the things that are real, actual, current issues for us in our own Christian walk. We're also not here to formulate policies for any broader group, right? We're not here to decide what somebody else should be doing. We're here really to delve into the scriptures and to delve into the history of the church and those who share wisdom with us. We're here to learn from them for ourselves, so that we can put into practice ourselves the things that God would have us do. So we're not here, as I say, to formulate doctrines or practices or whatever that somebody else should follow. We're here really to not so much to understand the scriptures, but to stand under the scriptures and allow them to judge us, and allow God to use the scriptures, the stories of the church, and its various heroes, its saints, and perhaps even its villains, but also to allow all of that to inform us and the way we live, and the way we live out our life as Christians, the way we allow Christ to live in and through us, so that it really is less and less you and I who are alive, but rather Christ lives in us. So we're looking for that kind of growth, that kind of Christian maturity. And so today we had a number of things came up that I thought would be fruitful for us to touch upon. One is the saints of the day, the martyrs of Lyon. Lyon, of course, is in France. It's in the south of France. It's a beautiful area. It was the western edges of the Roman Empire. It was Gaul. It was that part of the Roman Empire that was called Gaul. And there were Christians. Lyon had become quite a center for Christian. One of the great saints of the early church, one of the fathers of the church, who left behind a lot of really important writings and who contributed to the formulation of doctrines that we hold today very dearly, but also a great example of Christian living and how to live graciously, even in the midst of persecution and even in the face of martyrdom, of how to have integrity but also graciousness in the midst of that, was St. Irenaeus. He comes along a little bit later, but for now we have the martyrs of Lyon. And the story of what happened at Lyon to the Christians who were gathered there is rather telling, and it bears a certain kind of chilling similarity to experiences that we can observe today. If they don't even, if we ourselves are not subject to them, nevertheless we can observe this happening today. As Christianity took root and developed, of course, it challenged the authority of the Roman Empire, which was built on a fairly broad and tolerant system, in which anybody's gods were welcome because, hey, the more gods, the better. But it was also founded on the idea that the person of the emperor was actually also a god. And if you see coins that were minted in the first couple of centuries after Christ, you will see Son of God as an appellation for the emperor himself. So there was a certain built-in tension with these Christians who considered Jesus Christ to be the only Son of God, and the emperor as simply a human being like themselves, in terms of, at least in terms of divine status, not a god. And so one of the things that got Christians into trouble was that they would not worship the emperor in the same way that they worshipped God and worshiped Jesus Christ. So they refused on principle, as a matter of Christian integrity. They refused to make those compromises. And I think that's it's kind of a telling thing. I think we encounter a lot of pragmatism in our day. It was true back in the second century, and it's still true today, that people will say, what's the big deal? You don't have to really believe it. Just go through the motions, and so on. But these Christians recognize that motions have meaning, and that outward signs and witness really do transmit something, particularly to those with weaker consciences. And so they were very aware of their responsibility not to confuse people who might be new to the faith, not to confuse people who might be teetering on the brink or trying to make up their minds. They wanted to give a clear witness, and they wanted to give an unambiguous witness. So they would refuse to offer incense to the emperor. And that would start to get them into trouble. They lived differently than the other folks around them. They were in some respects like their neighbors, but in other ways the Christian community was very different and very special. They welcomed into their midst people who were otherwise unacceptable in society. They operated on different economic principles than the society around them. There were not the great discrepancies within the Christian communities between the rich and the poor. That doesn't mean that there wasn't property, but that there was much more voluntary sharing by those who were propertied and by those who had wealth. It was much more of the practice of voluntarily giving up some of that wealth so that those who had little could have more. And we have some accounts, even from the same period, from the first couple of centuries. We have accounts of how Christians would, if somebody came to them and was needy and they didn't themselves have enough bread, they would fast so that someone else could eat, and so on. So there's lots of ways in which Christians were considered a little bit weird and different. And of course, then they had their own rites, their own worship, their own practices. They had doctrines that were not well understood. People heard about them through rumors and whatever. Christians were careful not simply to throw open the doors to everyone, because it was a matter of, again, a matter of care to preserve what they had been given, so that it would not be diluted, it would not be edited, it would not be compromised, it would not be adulterated, if you will. So in order to preserve that, they were careful about who participated in these rites. There was also a certain amount of secrecy there because of the persecutions. So the Christians were not well known or well understood. Yesterday we celebrated Justin, who was martyred, but who did a wonderful job of explaining to the pagan world around him and to the authorities of the pagan world exactly what it is that Christians did. And something similar happened in Lyon here as well. But what happened was that, of course, little by little, Christians began to be suspect, and they started to get blamed for the ills of society. They were excluded from the public baths. They weren't allowed to go to the public baths. And then they were not allowed to engage in businesses. They were prevented from being in the marketplace, and they stopped being invited to things. They stopped being allowed to go to social events, to cultural events. They were not allowed to hold office or to perform public duties. And it got to the point where if Christians ventured out, there would be mobs and gangs and lynch mobs that would attack them, that would beat them up. Their homes were vandalized. Their property was seized, confiscated. Their homes were looted. And so the government got involved. But instead of going after the people who were perpetrating the vandalism or the lynchings or the muggings or the looting, instead they took the Christians into custody and started to question them under torture. And some gave in under that torture. Some of them made false confessions. Some of them conceded that, yes, Christians practiced cannibalism, or that Christians practiced incest, for example. I don't know where that comes from, but that was one of the charges. And so this news circulates. And you've got to remember that these are official public proceedings, these interrogations under torture, and the hearings before magistrates and judges and so on, public officials. These were official proceedings, and so they were documented. There were transcripts, and we have these transcripts. So they're preserved, and they're remarkable for their honest recording of what was said on both sides. That the transcriptionists or the transcribers or whoever took the notes and wrote them up formally afterwards were careful to record exactly what was said, both by those who were doing the interrogating and by those who were being tortured. So we have these accurate records, and we know a lot about what was said and what Christians were subjected to. But what happened was then that as Christians were in fact coerced into making these confessions, the anger, public opinion against them really turned bad. There was this sort of general outcry against the Christians, and we see that happening with other groups. We saw it happen with other groups in the 20th century. We saw it happen with the Jews for many centuries, getting blamed for the ills of society. But they went after the Christians in Lyon, and there were even among them Christians who were slaves. There were Christian families, wealthy Christian individuals who maintained the economic features of slavery, but who took to heart the idea that these Christians who were baptized were now brothers. We have this recorded in Paul's writings as well. And we have it from a number of other documents from that era, that slavery was an economic institution, but it was not the kind of, at least not among the Christians in most cases, was not that same kind of situation. There was bonded servitude, in some cases voluntary, in some cases people were purchased and bought and sold, and that's true. But those Christians who bought and sold them oftentimes would then raise them up in the faith and treat them again as brothers and sisters. It was more of an economic arrangement in some cases. But that's not to excuse what happened certainly later on in history, and we have sort of evolved in our understanding of the value of human beings and how to treat them. But back in the day, there were slaves who were also taken in. They were also questioned, and one in particular, Blandina, we have a transcript of what she said there, and she was tortured for an entire day, and all she would say is, "I am a Christian, and nothing vile is done among us." Eventually, those who survived the torture were taken into the public arena and were executed. So this is a whole period. This is a whole period of Christian history that really rewards some study. If we read these transcripts, if we read read the letter of Perpetua. It's easy to find online. I should have given a link to it. I'll try to remember to put that up. Read her letter. This is a woman who has, against the wishes of her parents, who were not Christian, has been put in prison for being a Christian. And in prison, she writes a long letter to her daughter. She's pregnant while she is in prison. She writes a long letter to her child explaining why her mother isn't there. And this is why. It is an incredibly moving testimony to the love of God and the love of Christ, and how even though the circumstances are so hard, that nevertheless she chooses fidelity to Christ in those circumstances. So these are kind of well worth perusing, well worth reading. Tertullian, one of the great writers of the early church, would eventually say that the blood of martyrs is the seed of Christians, and that it is precisely because people were willing to go to their deaths for these truths that Christianity had the credibility that it did. It was rather hard, and I think it's rather hard for us today to imagine that somebody would really be willing to, so many people would be willing to die such horrible deaths, such painful deaths, for the sake of a made-up story. That there is a reality to this that is confirmed by their willingness to undergo martyrdom. So that's the Martyrs of Lyon. You can read more about them. There's a link that will take you to James Kiefer's wonderful hagiographies, and you can also find more about them, I'm sure, if you do a little bit of searching around online. I do want to also talk a little bit about the readings this morning, and particularly the reading from Ecclesiastes. And I thought I had actually put some notes down here, and I don't know what happened to them. How did that happen? Where did they go? Okay, maybe they're up on top. I'm not sure. Nope. Okay, I don't know what happened to those notes, but let me see if I can reconstruct what I was thinking. We have here today let me just look at the reading so I can riff off of that. We have in this reading from Ecclesiastes a continuation of these musings by some sage, some ruler, some wealthy and influential person who has everything he's ever wanted. He's got all the power, he's got all the toys, he's got all the good stuff, and yet at the same time, he doesn't see the use of it, because after all, we're all going to die anyway. It doesn't matter whether you're wise or whether you're a fool. You're going to die, and you're going to leave everything that you own to somebody else, and you don't even have control over who eventually will get your toys. It might be somebody who you consider deserving. It might be somebody you consider worthy of them and who will make good use of them, somebody who you want to have them, and it might be a complete and utter fool who will squander everything that you have worked so hard to accomplish, somebody who will take it and not appreciate it and misuse it and lose it and so on. So this gets him depressed, right? Remember yesterday he was talking about, well, I'm going to just, eat, drink, and be merry. And he says that again today, right? So he turns his heart to despair. He says, might as well just enjoy life because that's all there is. Now, when we read this reading from Ecclesiastes, what he's writing here, what the author is writing in Ecclesiastes, is not God's prescriptive word. Okay, this is his experience, and this is his trying to wrestle with and grapple with this reality of the futility of life. That you work, that basically life's the B word, and then you die. And he's trying to deal with the depression that plunges him into. So, even when he says, that this is from the hand of God, because after all, God is the author of everything. right? Apart from God, who can eat? Who can have enjoyment? It's all God's doing. And he thinks, well, maybe the answer is that um, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy and good things to people who do good things. That um, maybe we earn our blessings from God, and maybe those who are fools and sinners ultimately get their comeuppance, but they get they get punishment rather than reward. Maybe that's what's going on. That's his speculation. That's his musing, and we can't isolate that and say, okay, well, this is the doctrine, and then forget that that's situated in the course of the whole arc of the biblical revelation. It's the whole arc of history, starting with what we have recorded from the very beginning about what happens to human hearts and what do humans have this natural tendency to do, all the way through the history of the chosen people and all the way into the New Testament when the Gentiles are added into the numbers, are added on. All of that happens, and it all culminates in this recognition that no, in fact, this is all part of a broader story, a wider story, um, and that the evil in the world is not always simply a consequence of our own actions or our own thoughts or our own choices, but in fact that we suffer the consequences of other people's actions as well. Where we get into trouble with this, I think, as Christians today and in every era, where we get into trouble is thinking that then we can identify whose fault it is, blame them for it, yell at them for it, punish them for it, fail to love them, exclude them, make them responsible for fixing it. And that's not the way it works. The fact is that the whole story, all the way from the sacrifices in Leviticus, all the way through Jesus Christ, and all the way through the rest of the history of the church, is that we are always paying the price for somebody else's mistakes, and somebody else is going to come along and have to pay the price for our mistakes. That we always are about the business of making good what has been done poorly in the past, and someone else, and recognizing too that we ourselves are gonna blow it, and somebody else is going to have to come along and not just pay the price, but have to correct what we have done as well. Now, in every era, we do our best. That's part of why we're here this morning. In every era, we do our best to try to discern what God's will is and to do that faithfully. But I think one of the ways that we fall short in our era is precisely in being so eager to take logs out of other people's eyes and not to accept our own complicity, the fact that we ourselves are compromised, the fact that we ourselves have a lot of work to do before we can take it upon ourselves to do that. And each one of us has a certain call and a certain mission to address certain things, I think, in the church. It is not any one individual's job to handle that. It is the Christian community as a whole that does it, and various gifts and various vocations are given to different people within that community to make it all happen. So that salvation proceeds not on the basis of a balance sheet in which we add up all the individual people who get saved, but rather it is that communities save the human race, and so on. So it's all part of being part of that community and being part of the Christian community, part of the body of Christ. That's all part and parcel of what it means to be a Christian. There are no loners, no maverick Christians out there who can hope to really fulfill the will of God for themselves, even for their own lives, let alone for whoever they're sent to in that kind of isolation. Paul recognizes this. He knows the need, even down the road, even 14 years after he first sets out on his mission, after he first receives his initial training, if you will, in the doctrine of Jesus Christ and understanding who Jesus is. When he gets that at Damascus, he goes off and he founds these communities. He discovers that the Holy Spirit comes when the gospel is preached to certain people, and so he begins to to recognize that, oh, he's being called to the Gentiles and not to the Jews. And he goes to double check. He goes to make sure. 14 years later, he goes to check with the folks in Jerusalem. Am I doing this right? Right? Have I blown this? And everybody says, no. Okay, we're just going to do this differently. We're going to take care of preaching the gospel to the circumcised, to the Jews, and you take the gospel to the uncircumcised. And making them circumcised is not part of the deal. The gospel is the gospel. The Holy Spirit comes when the gospel is preached. And that's the message. There are some Jews who will continue to maintain their Jewish practices and their Jewish ways and so on, and that's fine. They recognize that Jesus is the Messiah. There are now today many communities of Messianic Jews, and they still keep the Jewish festivals and holidays, but they understand them in the light of the gospel, and they understand them in the light of the fact that Jesus is the Messiah who was foretold, that he is the fulfillment of the promises. But the Gentiles don't have that history, and that's fine. The gospel still comes to them, is taken to them, and in their context and in their cultures, they recognize this reservoir, if you will, of grace that comes up like artesian wells, right? In various different places. It's all one aquifer, right? Jesus Christ is the aquifer. God is the aquifer. The Holy Spirit is the aquifer, and we drill wells at different places, and the same water comes up through the rock in each place. That's maybe one way to understand the differences. I'm sorry, I really don't know what happened to those notes. I had such good notes, but I don't have them here. So I know there was something else I wanted to say about it. This is okay. Sorry about that. Okay. I remember the one other thing that I wanted to say about what's happening in Ecclesiastes is that Ecclesiastes really, if Ecclesiastes tells us anything, it should be this: that our purpose for engaging in whatever kind of economic activity that we participate in, whether we manage money for a living, or whether we dig ditches for a living, or whether we beg for a living, whatever that is, that what Ecclesiastes does tell us, I think, that is a positive thing that we can take home and use for ourselves, is that productivity does not justify human life. That we do not decide whether people are valuable as part of our world or as part of our lives or valuable within our church based on whether they are productive or not. That productivity, particularly economic productivity, is not the criterion. This is what the sage in Ecclesiastes recognizes, is that economic productivity doesn't mean squat. That we're all going to die. You can't take it with you. You can't even show up at the pearly gates and expect to be congratulated for having done so well in your acquisition of wealth or security. What will come Jesus? What will, when Jesus comes, matter, he says, is whether in fact we have loved, whether we have in fact brought the world in, whether in fact we have been merciful to sinners, whether in fact we have loved our enemies. Those are the kinds of things that are going to matter. Faith, hope, and love are what's going to matter at the judgment. So it's not how productive you've been, and we don't decide whether people get to live or die or eat or not eat based on whether they are productive contributors. And there's a line out of St. Paul that is greatly misunderstood and misinterpreted when he says those who do not work should not eat. What he does not say there, though, is that those who do not work should not be given food. He never says that. He makes that as a moral recommendation to he recommends that to the conscience of the individual themselves. Decide for yourself whether you have done enough so that you can draw on the community's resources. He does not endow the community with the authority to deny others a living. So there's a subtle distinction, and we miss that, I think, in Paul's writings. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up here. I've been running my trap for half an hour here, and I've put a link to this. This is a good little book, and because it's the Bible in the Contemporary World. It's by Richard Bauckham, who's a very respected scripture scholar, New Testament scholar, and he has a couple of. This is a collection of articles of. He has a collection of this is a collection of articles from other things that he has written, and they've been edited into this book. The thing that I wanted to bring to your attention here is a couple of chapters where he deals with the question of freedom, because that's at the top of a lot of people's minds these days. And he examines different understandings of freedom. The whole of chapter 5 is called Freedom and Belonging. And he talks about democratic freedoms. Freedom from limits is one way that people understand freedom, that freedom means nothing is denied. Nothing is denied to me. Everything is allowed to me. There's freedom as maximal independence. Freedom means that I don't have to have other people. I don't have to be responsible to other people. There's freedom as consumer choice, and he has a lot of very articulate things to say about how consumer choice has become our model for what freedom means, that I can take what I please, that I can have what I like, even in terms of the worship of God, even in terms of who God is. I can take my pick as long as I'm a good person, as long as I don't hurt anybody, right? This is sound familiar. This is the moralistic therapeutic deism, that basically God is there to be the therapist for my life. God is there to make me happy as long as I'm a moral person. And then he also deals with the other interesting question, which is something that has come up in the last century or so. It's been growing since the Enlightenment, but it's borne fruit in what we think of as what we call today postmodernism, and that is the idea that that any truth claims, particularly the freedom to hold the truth, freedom to hold truths, that in fact is somehow always going to be suspect, that every claim to truth is necessarily oppressive. So he goes to that. There's also a whole article on what is truth. So I recommend this book. It's not a real easy read. It's not light reading, but he has some really profound and good things to say. So I recommend it highly. This is my endorsement. And I put a link to the Amazon place where you can find it if you would like to read that. I'm kind of out of verbiage, I think, for now. And I just want to go back here and make sure that I haven't missed anything. Hello, Karen. Let's see. And Steve is there. Hi, Steve. And Karen and Joan. I think that may be the three of you, but thank you for joining me this morning. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I really do. I look forward to suggestions or questions or whatever. That doesn't mean I'm going to necessarily address them. It may not be something that I feel like I can do. It may not be something I feel like we should be doing, and it may not be something I can do a good job of. But I'm really here hoping that we can find some way through these engagements to help one another grow, to help each other grow in our Christian walk, in our Christian maturity, in our discipleship, so that we grow to the full stature of Christ, and so that we really do become walking, living, breathing icons of God in the world, so that when people see us, they see past us and they see through us to the God who has done something that if you really knew me, you would not think I was capable of, because I'm not. That's what we want people to see. We want people to see how God has done incredible things that we would be unable to do ourselves. Not in the sense of, dramatic magic acts, but just to say, wow, where did this person get this peace? Where does this person get this joy in the midst of hardship, in the midst of adversity? Where does this person get to be so joyful? How is this person so peaceful in the midst of so much conflict? How is this person so hopeful when everything looks so discouraging and depressing? Where does this person get their hope from? That's the kind of thing that I want us to grow in. That's what I want St. Paul's to grow in, is in that kind of attitude. How do we become so detached from our own concerns about what I think I need in order to be happy? I also posted yesterday, while we're on that topic, I posted yesterday on the Facebook page a lovely set of quotations from a nun in England, I believe, maybe Scotland, on the Isle of Wight. Yes, she's a nun, Benedictine nun in the Isle of Wight. I guess she's dead now, but she had some wonderful things to say about how to face challenges and crises and fear with that kind of equanimity and hopefulness that comes from the Holy Spirit, that is not based on knowledge that we can acquire for ourselves, but that instead comes from a supernatural source. How do we do that? And one of her big things that she harps on is this idea of detachment. I don't automatically relate all the bad things that are happening to how is this going to make my life miserable, but instead to say, how is this an opportunity for me to love someone? How is this an opportunity for me to be kind and gentle and merciful when my first natural response would be to criticize or to condemn or to confront? So that when I do confront, if I have to confront, that I can do so in a way that hopefully will click and not simply create a reaction. Can't guarantee that because people have freedom, but at least I can be the best person I can be in that situation. That's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm hoping for will come out of these sessions. If there's a better way for me to do that, please let me know if you can think of ways. I'm more than happy to hear. I want to learn. I want to do this better. So let's stay in touch. Let's stay in contact. And God bless you today. I'll be back at 5 o'clock for evening prayer. I think this actually worked. Although the feedback screen I'm seeing looks a little blurry, but I'm going to hope that this went out and looks pretty good. And God bless you. I love you. I'm praying for you. Please pray for me.